Hi everyone, so this week we're going to be covering chapter 12, and this chapter is all on getting into some more advanced experiments and looking at experiments now that actually use more than one independent variable. So we'll talk about what that means and kind of break down how that changes the design of the experiment and maybe what types of tests we use at the end. All right, so this week we'll be covering chapter 12, experiments with more than one independent variable. This chapter is going to build off of what we've covered last week. Specifically, we'll talk about how we can go from using one independent or manipulated variable to using more than one independent variable. By looking at more than one of these variables in the same study, we're actually able to uncover some additional information about how these variables interact with each other. We'll first start off by briefly reviewing some of the types of studies we went over last week, specifically those that simply use one independent variable. We'll then talk about experiments that use two independent variables at the same time and how, by employing this method, we're able to see how these two variables interact with each other. We'll also discuss factorial variations of these types of studies, as well as discuss how we can go about identifying such factorial designs in your own readings and experiences. So let's first review single independent variable studies. These are studies that simply manipulate one thing and see how that manipulation changes the outcome or dependent variable. Let's take a look at two studies that use this single independent variable design. The first is a study that tried to answer whether people are angry when they drink. Take a look at the two graphs for a study by Aaron Duke and colleagues in 2011. Here they examine the effects of alcohol on aggression. The placebo group drank orange juice with a very small amount of vodka in it, and the alcohol group drank enough vodka to reach a 0.1 blood alcohol concentration. Then participants played a computer game with an opponent who was in another room, which actually they were playing against a computer. So when that fake player made a mistake, the participant's job was to deliver a shock as punishment. Both the intensity and the duration of the shocks that were administered were measured. The graph on the left shows that the drunk group administered more intense shocks than the placebo group, and the graph on the right indicates that the drunk group administered shocks of a longer duration than the placebo group as well. The second study we'll look at here involves cell phone use while driving. Strayer and Drews in 2004 instructed participants to talk on a hands-free cell phone while playing on a realistic driving simulator. For two segments, they carried on a conversation on the phone, and for the other two segments, they were not on the phone. The order was counterbalanced for participants, and the dependent variable was break onset time, or how long it took someone to start braking. As you can see in the graph, drivers used the hands-free cell phone were slower to hit the brakes than those who were not talking on the phone and were instead having a conversation with someone in the same location as themselves. Hopefully you can see how both of these two studies simply manipulated one thing, either the amount of alcohol or the use of a cell phone while driving. And they both observed how this one variable changed the outcome variable, or the intensity and length of electric shock, or the time it took someone to start braking. We're now going to talk about how studies can manipulate more than one thing or use multiple independent variables at the same time and observe how they each affect the dependent variable. One of the most important reasons why a researcher might want to design a study that uses more than one independent variable is to observe how each of those variables interact with one another, or observe an interaction effect. An interaction effect, also known as simply an interaction, occurs when the effect of one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable. An interaction between two independent variables allows researchers to determine whether it depends. Let's reconsider the cell phone and driving study. This time, a second independent variable, say age, is added in to determine whether the effect of cell phones depend on age. A mathematical way to describe an interaction between two independent variables is a difference in differences. In other words, it's the effect of one independent variable, such as cell phone condition versus no cell phone condition, on the level of the other independent variable. For example, reaction times of older adults versus younger drivers. Let's now talk more about these interactions and look at some examples of experiments that investigate how two independent variables interact with each other. Here we see some graphs that display results from studies with two independent variables and one dependent variable. The first study, or the graph on the left, looks at the two independent variables of type of food, either ice cream or pancakes, and the temperature of the food, hot or cold, and the dependent variable of how much you like that food. You can see here that the graph actually has two lines. This is different from previous graphs we've looked at that only have the one line on them. We use one axis on the graph, here the bottom axis, to represent one of the independent variables, and the color of line to represent the other independent variable. We can see here, just by looking at the shape of the graph, that there is an interaction effect present. We know this because the two lines are intersecting or crossing over one another. If we think about what this is describing, we can see that the dependent variable changes based on both of the two independent variables, but that it depends on the patterns of their two levels. So you like ice cream when it's cold, but like pancakes when they're hot. So you can't say that you always like hot or cold food, but that it depends on both variables together. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see another example of an interaction effect. Here we're looking at the two independent variables of either saying sit or not saying anything, and having a treat or not having a treat, and their effect on the dependent variable of the chance a dog will actually sit. We can once again see that the lines on the graph are intersecting, but what we can notice from the two graphs is that we can switch which independent variable is used for the axis or lines. It doesn't matter. Both ways we still see the same outcome, that the dependent variable changes depending on both levels of both independent variables, but that we can see an effect only when certain conditions are met. Another name for studies that use more than one independent variable are called factorial designs. Again, a factorial design is an experiment in which there are two or more independent variables. The independent variables are also called factors. Consider the Strayer and Drews study that examined whether the effect of driving while talking on a cell phone depended on the driver's age. There are two independent variables, cell phone use and driver age. If you look at the figure here, you can see how factorial designs cross two independent variables. By crossing cell phone use and driver age, we end up with 4 cells, or unique conditions. That's 2 levels of independent variable 1 by 2 levels of independent variable 2, which equals 4 cells or conditions. You might have noticed that Strayer and Drews manipulated cell phone use, but they did not manipulate age. They couldn't manipulate age because they can't assign people to be young or old. Thus, age is a participant variable. However, it's treated as an independent variable in a factorial design. Sometimes researchers conduct factorial designs to test whether an independent variable affects different kinds of people or people in different situations in the same way. They test the limit to which an effect exists on another variable. This figure shows the results from Strayer and Drews' cell phone and age study in a table form and in a graph form. You'll notice that in the line graph, the two lines are parallel, which indicates that the effect of talking on a cell phone did not depend on age. In other words, there was no interaction between cell phone use and age. You can see that older drivers overall were slower at braking than younger drivers, and participants overall were slower at braking while on a cell phone than when not. But that both young and older drivers took longer to brake when they were talking on a cell phone than when they were not. Testing the limit to which an effect extends relates to external validity. Remember the alcohol and aggression study? What if researchers wondered if the effect of alcohol on aggression depends on body weight? DeWall and colleagues in 2010 randomly assigned men to a drunk group and a placebo group, and then measured their aggression through shock intensity during the shock game. As you can see by looking at the two graphs, which are the same except that the independent variables are switched around, the effect of alcohol was very strong for heavier men. Using a factorial design to test limits is called testing for moderators. A moderator is an independent variable that changes the relationship between another independent variable and a dependent variable. A moderator results in an interaction. The effect of one independent variable depends on or is moderated by the level of another independent variable. For example, body weight moderates the effect of alcohol on aggression. Factorial designs can also be used to test theories. Many theories make predictions about how variables might interact with one another. Factorial designs are a good way to test an interaction to see if the results are consistent with your theory. Let's look at two examples of theories that can be tested using a factorial design: a theory of alcohol cues and a memory theory. So let's first look at the question, why does alcohol cause aggression? There are various theories about this, and one of them is that alcohol can become cognitively associated with thoughts of aggression. Bartholow and Hines in 2006 tested this theory by having participants view images and words on a computer monitor. They were told to indicate whether a string of letters was a word or not a word. Some of the words were aggression related and others were neutral. Before seeing each string of letters, participants were briefly primed with a photo on the computer screen. Sometimes the photo related to alcohol, and other times it was a photo of a plant. It was hypothesized that participants would respond more quickly to identify aggression-related words. This figure shows how the theory was tested by crossing two independent variables, photo type by word type, providing us with 4 individual cells. The results from the study are depicted here in a data table and a line graph. There was indeed an interaction between the two independent variables and was as expected based on the theory. When participants had just seen a photo of alcohol, they identified aggressive words more quickly. When participants had been primed with a photo of a plant, they were slower to identify aggressive words. This interaction supported the theory that people cognitively associate alcohol cues with aggressive concepts. Let's now look at our other example on memory. In this study, the researchers used a factorial design to test their theory about why memory develops with age. The results showed that the interaction of the two independent variables in the study, here participant age and type of item, was once again predicted by the theory that children's memory capacity can be better than adults when they know a lot about the topic. The study had a 2x2 design with a participant variable, child experts or adult novices, and an independent variable, digits versus chess pieces. The number of items recalled was the dependent variable. The results are shown here in the figure, and they clearly demonstrate that while the adults had better memory than children for digits, the children had a better memory than adults for the domain in which they had more knowledge, in this case, chess pieces. When analyzing or looking at the results of a factorial study that has two independent variables, there are actually 3 results we need to interpret: 2 main effects, one for each independent variable, and 1 interaction effect, or the interaction between the 2 variables. Let's discuss each of these. The main effect is the overall effect of one independent variable on the dependent variable, averaging over levels of other independent variables, and it identifies a simple difference. If you have 2 independent variables, then you will look for 2 main effects. In the top figure is data from a word association study. One independent variable, type of word, is highlighted in blue. The other independent variable, type of photo, is in yellow. To look for a main effect of word type, you would compute the reaction time to aggressive words and reaction time to neutral words by averaging across the 2 photo conditions. The marginal means for aggressive and neutral words are in the far right-hand column of the table. Notice that there is not much difference in the reaction times to aggressive words, 555 milliseconds, and to neutral words, 557 milliseconds, in the marginal mean on the right. It appears that there is not a main effect for word type because they're not very different. To determine if there's a main effect for photo type, you would compute reaction time after seeing the alcohol photos averaged over word type, and reaction time after seeing plant photos also averaged over word type. These averages are presented at the bottom in yellow. Again, there's not much of a difference between the 2 means, 556.5 for the alcohol photo, and 555.5 for the plant photo. So there is no main effect of phototype either. Main effects may or may not be statistically significant. Although researchers use marginal means to look for main effects, they use statistics to find out if the differences are statistically significant. The bottom table is from a study on aggression in drunk and sober men, and the marginal means revealed a statistically significant main effect for drinking condition. In this case, men in the drunk condition were more aggressive than men in the placebo condition, and a statistically significant main effect for body weight. Here, heavy men were more aggressive than light men. Remember, a main effect equals an overall effect. Calling something the main effect doesn't mean it's the most important effect. It simply means that it's an overall effect of one independent variable at a time. When you have a factorial design with two independent variables, there will be one interaction effect to look for. This is the interaction between the two independent variables. Let's look at how we might go about identifying an interaction effect simply by looking at the results in a table. The table on the top shows how to compute the interaction for the alcohol and aggression study. Remember that an interaction measures differences in differences. You begin by computing two differences. Start with one level of independent variable 1, alcohol photos. The difference between the aggressive and neutral conditions for the alcohol photos is 551 minus 562, or negative 11. Then move to the second level of independent variable 1, plant photos. The difference between aggressive and neutral words for plant photos is 559 minus 552, or 7. Go the same direction both times, aggressive minus neutral in this case. There are two differences, negative 11 and positive 7. This difference of 18 points total between the two of these is statistically significant, and you can conclude that there's an interaction between word type and phototype. The bottom table shows the data from the cell phone and driving study. The top example focused on row differences, but this example examines column differences. The number 174 is not significantly larger than 132. So there is no interaction between cell phone condition and driving age. Remember, you will still need to perform a significance test to know for sure if the two numbers you get are significantly different from one another or not. Now, it's much easier to detect interactions from a graph rather than computing them from a table. If the results are plotted in a line graph, as in the top two examples here, you look to see if the lines are parallel. In the graph on the top left, the lines are not parallel, so there is an interaction between word type and phototype. The lines are crossing each other. In the graph on the top right, the lines are close to parallel, so there probably is no interaction between age and cell phone condition. In both cases, you would need to perform a significance test still to find out for sure, but you can start with the graph to get an idea. Interactions can also be detected from bar graphs. So in the bottom two bar graphs we can see, imagine connecting the tops of the two pink bars and the tops of the two orange bars with straight lines. Would the lines then be parallel or not? If the lines are parallel, then there's no interaction between your independent variables, but if the lines aren't parallel, or in other words, they intersect each other, then there is an interaction between your independent variables. There is an interaction between phototype and word type in the left-hand bar graph, but no interaction in the right-hand bar graph. When describing an interaction in words, you should start with one level of independent variable 1 and explain what is happening with independent variable 2 at that level. Then move to the next level of independent variable 1 and do that same thing. This approach is depicted in the graph and description on the left. Here you might say, child chess experts can remember more chess pieces than digits, but adult chess novices can remember more digits than chess pieces. Another approach is to use such phrases as especially for and depends on, as is depicted on the right, which states the drunk group was more aggressive than the placebo group, especially for heavy men. It's important to note that when a study shows both a main effect and an interaction, the interaction is almost always more important, and that there may be real differences in marginal means, but the more exciting part is the interaction. For example, the Walls study on alcohol, aggression, and body weight found a main effect for body weight and for alcohol intake, and a significant interaction between body weight and alcohol intake. While the main effect for alcohol intake might hide the fact that there's an interaction, but in reality, the interaction itself is actually the most interesting part of the findings. This slide is a good reference for the range of possible outcomes from a single 2x2 factorial design. And again, this just is a continuation of the possible outcomes from a single 2x2 factorial design. So we can see that there are a total of 8 possible outcomes when performing a 2x2 factorial design. Next, we're going to talk about some variations that can exist in factorial designs. We'll discuss variations such as having an independent variable with more than 2 levels, having an independent variable that is a within groups variable, or even adding in a third independent variable altogether. Remember that in an independent groups factorial design, also known as between subjects factorial, both independent variables are manipulated between groups. If the design is a 2x2, there are 4 different groups of participants, each undergoing some different variation of the experiment. For example, if you wanted 50 participants in each cell or condition, then you would need 200 total participants, 50 in each of the 4 groups. In within groups factorial designs, also known as repeated measures factorial designs, both independent variables are manipulated within groups. Thus, if you have a 2x2 within groups design, there's only one group of participants, but they participate in all 4 groups or cells one at a time. For example, if you wanted 50 participants in each cell or condition, you would only need 50 participants total because each of those 50 people would be in each of the 4 conditions. The figure here shows how many participants a researcher would need to obtain 12 observations per cell in each of 3 types of designs. Notice that each different participant is labeled with their own participant number. Independent group designs require the largest number of total participants for the study, since each condition uses unique people, whereas within groups designs are most efficient in terms of the number of participants needed, since they only require a total of 12 participants in this case, who complete all the conditions. You can also see that a mixed design, which we'll discuss in more detail later, is a mix between these 2 design types, where one independent variable is measured as a between subjects variable and the other is measured as a within subjects variable. This method requires a moderate number of participants compared to both other methods. So let's talk more about this mixed factorial design. Mixed factorial designs are a combination of independent groups designs and within groups designs. One independent variable is manipulated as independent groups, and the other independent variable is manipulated within groups. In a 2x2 mixed factorial design with 50 people in each cell, you would need 100 participants total, which is twice as many participants as a within groups design, but half as many participants as a fully independent groups design. There are many reasons why you might choose to use this design method. Perhaps you want to reduce the number of participants you need from a completely between subjects design, yet you also don't want each participant to have to sit through 4 different conditions, as that might get tedious or induce carryover effects from condition to condition. So you decide to go with a mix of the 2 in order to minimize the cons of each method while also maximizing the pros. Researchers can also add more levels to their independent variables. Suppose that Strayer and Drews decided to turn their 2x2 factorial design on cell phone use and driving into a 2x3 factorial design by adding a 3rd level to the cell phone condition independent variable. Perhaps have a handheld cell phone, hands-free cell phone, and then no cell phone condition at all. This would change the number of cells from 4 in a 2x2 to 6 in a 2x3. You can see this depicted in the graph figure on the left. Factorials are notated like this: blank times blank. The number of blanks tell you the number of independent variables, and the numbers that you put into those blanks tell you the number of levels of each of those independent variables. Suppose that Strayer and Drews increase the number of levels on the age variable from 2 to 4. Now it is a 3 self-owned condition by 4 age factorial design. This is presented in the figure on the right. There are 12 total cells, making it a 3 by 4 factorial design. Again, notice that since there are still only 2 independent variables, there are still only 2 blank spaces, but the numbers in them correspond to the number of levels each variable has. The 3 corresponding to the variable levels in yellow, and the 4 corresponding to the variable levels in blue. Here, main effects can still be calculated by using marginal means and seeing whether they are different. Interactions are most easily detected with a line graph to see whether the lines are parallel. In both cases, though, statistical tests would still need to be performed to determine if the main effects and interactions are in fact statistically significant. Sometimes more than 2 independent variables are needed. For example, suppose Strayer and Drews decided to add a third independent variable, such as traffic condition, and suppose this had 2 levels, dense traffic and light traffic. So now we have a 2 age by 2 cell phone condition by 2 traffic condition factorial design. It's also called a 3-way design because there are 3 independent variables. This also means that there would be 8 cells, 2 times 2 times 2. If you look at the table, you can see that the best way to represent a 3-way design is to create the 2 by 2 table twice, one for each level of independent variable 3, in this case traffic condition. In order to graph the 3-way design, you would do the same thing by having 2 graphs side by side, one for heavy traffic and one for light traffic. It may be helpful to think of this as a third dimension to your variable condition, such that the newly added third variable extends your table out in a third dimension. However, thinking about it in terms of a second table and graph is perfectly reasonable as well. When there are 3 independent variables, as in a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design, there will be 3 main effects to test. Remember that main effects are a simple overall difference that examine the effect of one independent variable averaged across the other 2 independent variables. The table examines 3 main effects within the cell phone study: cell phone condition, driver age, and traffic condition. Drivers brake more slowly in the cell phone condition than in the control condition. Older drivers brake more slowly than younger drivers, and drivers are slower to brake in heavy traffic than in light traffic. Thus, there are main effects of all 3 independent variables: cell phone condition, driver age, and traffic condition. In a 3-way design, there are 3 possible 2-way interactions: age by traffic condition, age by cell phone condition, and cell phone condition by traffic condition. To examine each of these 2-way interactions, you make 3 2 by 2 tables, shown in the figure here. After computing the means, you can look at the difference in differences. However, it's probably easier to graph the interaction and look for non-parallel lines. We can see in these example graphs that there are no 2-way interactions present. However, this should still be followed up by statistical tests just to make sure and look for statistical significance. In the cell phone study, there is also one 3-way interaction. This 3-way interaction is driver age by cell phone condition by traffic condition. If the 3-way interaction is significant, then it means that the 2-way interaction between 2 of the independent variables depends on the level of the third independent variable. The difference in differences is different. It's easiest to look at 3-way interactions by looking at line graphs. In the top graph, there is not a 3-way interaction because there is no 2-way interaction on the left and no 2-way interaction on the right. In the bottom graph, however, there is a 3-way interaction because there is a crossing interaction on the left and a spreading interaction on the right. So the 2 sides show different 2-way interactions. So that tells us there is a 3-way interaction as well. Again, here we can look at the 2 graphs to determine, is there a 3-way interaction present? Once again, there is no 3-way interaction present in the top graph since each 2-way interaction in this is the same. So although there are two-way interactions present here, since they are the same at both levels of the third independent variable, then no three-way interaction exists. However, we can see that there is a three-way interaction present on the bottom graph. If you look closely, you can see that the two-way interactions are actually opposite from one another in the bottom graph. Since these change or are different at the two levels of our third independent variable, in this case traffic level, then there is a three-way interaction present. So you might be asking yourself, what's the point of all these interactions? Or why do we even need to bother focusing on them when the main effects are giving me clear and concise information on what a variable is affecting? Well, it's important to remember what I said before, that often when there is an interaction effect, it is the most interesting finding to look at. And it turns out that most findings in psychological studies are actually interaction effects. Think about it once again in terms of the Strayer and Drews driving study. Perhaps talking on the phone had no main effect when performed with solely undergraduate students. However, there was a significant interaction of talking on the phone with driver age. We wouldn't want to conclude from a study that talking on the phone had no effect simply because we didn't see it in our college-age students, because then our research findings could go on to prove inaccurate information for older drivers who may think that they'd be perfectly fine to talk on the phone and drive as well, yet could result in them getting into more motor accidents. This is also why careful and thoughtful research design planning is so important. You have to think ahead on what variables you should be including to anticipate what could result in an interaction being found. It's also important to be able to recognize an interaction effect when you're reading about research. So there are certain clues that will let you recognize a factorial design when you're reading a scholarly journal article or a popular press article, which can then alert you to look out for any significant interactions. So typically in the method section of any scholarly journal article, you'll find information about the design of the study. One clue that you're reading about a factorial design is that you'll see mention of some type of 4x2 or 3x2, 3x3x3 design, and so forth. Again, remember that these numbers tell you the number of independent variables in the study and the number of levels in each of those independent variables. You might read the word significant or see the notation p is less than 0.05 to let you know that a main effect or interaction is significant. You might also read about an ANOVA, MANOVA, or F-test being conducted to examine main effects and interactions. Popular press articles usually don't specify what kind of design was used because journalists are trying to make the research simpler so it can be understood by the general public. So there are different clues you'll look for when reading a popular press article. One such clue is looking for the phrase, "it depends," or "only when" to describe an interaction. For example, driving ability while talking on a cell phone depended on the age of the driver. Another such clue is looking for participant variables such as age, gender, or ethnicity. The participant variable might moderate another independent variable, and when there's a moderator, then there's an interaction, and that a factorial design was used. For example, reading a research result such as older adults took longer to brake when talking on a cell phone, whereas younger adults did not show a decrease in driving ability.